Hey there, thanks for joining me. This time we're going to be talking about how to use some different brushes for some basic brush techniques. And these are things that you'll use in your paintings as you get more experienced in acrylic painting. The first one we want to talk about is called stippling. Stippling is accomplished with a brush where you go up and down, up and down. And while you're doing it, you're plunging like a piston, like a little piston in a robot or a machine. But you're not doing it in the same spot like this. You go up, and then you turn it in your hand, and you go down. So each time you do that, while you're going up and down, you go like this with the brush in your hand. So when you do it, you get different stamps. So watch what happens when I do this. I'm going to take some blue, and I'm going to stipple it like so you can see. And see how the pattern looks different? It doesn't look the same. This is a really good way to get things like trees, clouds, pieces of land, grass. If you do it very small, people can also blend like this. So as a good example, let's do a little tree. I'm going to get some of another green here, like this. And you can use stippling to come out like that. Let's make it a little bit darker. And we could stipple an area by making it darker by adding a color that's opposite or near opposite on the color wheel. And there's a variety of different brushes that work better for stippling. This particular brush here is really good. It's like a stamping brush. But you can use other brushes for stippling. For instance, let's take a flat brush or a wash brush. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get some orange. I'm going to go next to this stipple. You can still stipple with just about anything you want. Get a little bit of red in there. All it is a way to create texture with different colors. If you overdo it and you keep going over at the same thing, even if you add another color in, say we'll add in some purple, when you start out, you can see the little marks of the texture because the paint dives in and then it comes out and it leaves behind paint in different spots. But just like anything, if you overdo it and you just keep going like this, you won't see your color anymore. It's going to disappear. It's going to become one color. I'm going to go ahead and clean off my brush there. Get the extra off. And when it comes to stippling, you can use light or dark colors. It doesn't really matter. You just have to think about what you're trying to accomplish. I'm going to go ahead and put this in my water. And we're going to move on to the pendulum stroke. In the videos that I teach you how to paint a couple of beginner paintings, you're going to want to make sure that you pay attention to the pendulum stroke. So what that is what you're going to be doing is you're going to be holding the brush in your hand like this, straight up and down, and you're going to swing it like a pendulum, which means a half circle like this. Except when it hits the canvas, it's going to leave paint behind there. The reason for that is, let's grab a little bit of paint so you can see. It tends to be thicker in the middle, and then when you lift off, it gets thin like that. Now by itself, it looks kind of rough like that until you go to paint something on it together. So here's some wet paint with some more wet paint cutting through it using the pendulum stroke. And this is a good way to gently blend one color into the next. And you'll see that in our sunset painting that we do. Next up is the angled stroke. The angled stroke, or sometimes called the X stroke, is a stroke where you use different angles to accomplish what you're trying to do. So, for instance, I'm going to use this round brush and I'm going to put down a dark green. So I'm going to make some green, some yellow, and some blue. I'm mixing it together. I'm going to make it a little bit darker with some red. And I'm going to pat this whole area like this just to add some color in to start up so you can see. And an angled stroke is a way to make things look angular. When you use a brush and create angled marks, it feels sharp. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a little bit of this yellow, and I'm going to start making marks that are angled. They go in different directions. They do not go like this or like this. They go in diagonals in different areas like this. And what this is another way to create texture, to blend. If you do it enough in a certain area, you can start to get a color that looks very similar but still see brush strokes. And an angled stroke is good for things like rocks. If you do it enough, you can get the shapes down very well. Right now, I'm mixing some different colored grays to make a nice rock. I'm going to make it just a little bit on the reddy orange side. Okay, so right below this area where we did an angled stroke, I'm going to go ahead and add in some different lines like this. Now notice how the ends are nice and rounded there. If I change my brush, I will get a different feel. So now I'm going to use a flat brush, which feels already kind of sharp on the edges. So if I turn like this, I will start to get different kind of feeling and texture to some of these different things that I'm putting in. If you see here, as I'm rotating my brush, going different angles, it's starting to feel a little rocky. Move some in there. And I'm bopping it around and I'm pulling at different angles like this. And by the time you're done, you can use bigger brushes. We can make this whole thing one big rock if you want, so you can see how that works. Make some angled brush strokes here like this. Some there. Get some darker color under here. And you can start to see it taking shape like so. And by the time you're done, you can get something that you work on a lot that looks very organic. It's also a good brush for doing something like this. If you need nice lines that come together as an angled stroke, you can use your brush to create patterns that are kind of like drawing. And by the time you're done, you can blend them together in a similar way as you would with drawing. So it's just another technique to help you. Next, we're going to move on to scumbling. I love saying scumbling. It sounds funny. A scumble is really just a scribble. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this brush right here. It's a little filbert brush. And a scumble is going to take a little bit of paint and it's going to go ahead and make it scribbly. So I'm going to take a little bit of a scumble here. And I'm turning my brush sideways. I don't have a lot of paint on it because you don't need a lot. And it's just supposed to scribble along and make something kind of random. And when you're using this randomness, it's really good for things like land, things like that. So here's some scumbles, and notice how the brush did all the work to make it look like land. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in a couple of little colors of scumble in between. I'm going to scumble myself a little bit on the sides. And scumbles don't always have to be side to side. They can be circular. But when you do that and you change different things, it's going to make it feel different ways. So just be aware of that when you're scumbling. Okay. So if we go back over here while that's drying, we can see how fine line work comes into play. I'm going to finish the little stipple area up here by the tree. And when I do that, it's important that I have a dry brush. Usually with stippling, you have a pretty dry brush. If you have a wet brush, it holds too much water and it turns all your paint splashes that you go straight up and down with into a big old pile of junk. So we don't want that. We want a mostly dry brush like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to get a little bit of yellow and a little bit of white and just a little bit of green, real tiny bit. And I'm going to make sure that I scumble some brightness back into this little tree. So you want to go ahead and you want to really spread out the bristles on it. And I'm going to go up here and just very lightly dance on it. So you can have multiple layers of stippling to make something look dimensional. So you have darks and you have lights. Put a couple out there, here and there, like so. By the time we're done, we might have something that looks tree-like. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to show you fine line work. With a fine line, you want a liner brush. Now when liner brushes come out, they feel like a little stabby device. You need to get them wet to wake them up. Any brush that comes from the factory is going to have a fixative or a setter on it, something that keeps the brush together and keeps it from coming apart until it gets to you and it's ready to paint. So it just keeps it nice looking and you can tell what shape it is. So this one's still a little stiff there. You can see that area over here is still sticky. So I'm going to go in here and keep cleaning. Some people clean their brushes with Dawn dish soap or a teensy bit of alcohol, rubbing alcohol and water to get them ready, but I usually just kind of wake them up by moving them back and forth. So what you want to do is you want to get the extra water out for this, okay, like so, just so you can see the initial pull. You always want to make sure that it's nice and pointy and that it's soggy enough that it can bend nicely like this. Because the point of a liner brush is that you can gently use the tip or you can press down further and further to get it to follow you like a little puppy follows somebody that they just love. So what we're going to do over here is we're going to go over and we're going to get some black and you have to pull it through your paint so that it's all the way covered. And then here's some line work there. So gently, this is a dragging brush. You never go like this. You never push it. You always pull it or drag it. So if you're very gentle, you can get little lines, but if you press hard, you can get thicker lines. Now you see how kind of crusty that is? That's because our paint doesn't have enough water. So if we add water to our paint and we get a section going, I'm going to go ahead and add some water to my black so that it's more like ink or watercolor. When that happens, we're going to get a very nice trail of paint that's going to go for quite some time. So let's see how long we can get it to go. We keep it going. There it goes. Still going. Still don't need to refill it. Still going. So you can see that a liner brush, the longer it is, the more it bends, but also the more fluid it holds. It's almost like a pen at that point. So you can do nice things with lines like that, but you can also use it to create little details. So for instance, I'm going to go up here into this tree and I'm going to go down into our fake land here and I'm going to drag it. See how I never push it? I'm always pulling it. Give it some little roots like so. And pop some out like that. And so you can see how these different techniques start to add up. We'll add a little bit here of some texture in our tree using little gentle brush strokes, never pushing, always pulling like so. So by the time you're done, you can get just about any little nature thing you want with a couple of these types of brush strokes. Now, speaking of nature, we have the curved stroke, sometimes called the U stroke or the W stroke or the M stroke. But really what it is it's strokes that are curved in some way. They might be curved and long like this. They might be real curved. It doesn't matter. They might be one against the other. What matters is the shape that they make. A lot of times people use brushes that are already curved to make curved strokes. So I'm going to go ahead and use a filbert brush. Let me find my little Phil here. Where'd he go? There he is. Come here, little Phil. So you have a filbert brush there. I'm going to go ahead and squeeze out the extra paint and stuff, so I want to reshape it again. Sometimes brushes get used and they hold paint on the inside and they spread apart. So you need to squeeze them a little bit, wobble, and pull. Okay, so I'm going to get a curved stroke. I'm going to start with a little bit of some blue here, just to have something for it to show up on. I'm going to do a little bit of water. So I'm going to go ahead and create a teal, which is, anybody know? Go ahead and shout it out if you know it. It is blue and green. A little bit of teal here and there. And right now I'm using the Pendulum Stroke, just a small version of it, like so. Okay, so that's flat right now. And now I'm going to go ahead and get some white on my brush. I'm going to drag through, and I'm going to use a curved stroke, like so. Usually works a little bit better if you start in the back. This brush is a thick fella. And notice how these feel like they're starting to create waves. Do you see it? I'm gonna dance and plop a little bit of white on top of those, like there. These little waves are starting to appear. And you can do the other way. It doesn't always have to be like this. Your curved strokes don't have to always go this way, like a smiley face. They can go this way. They can go sideways if you want. It doesn't matter. As long as they're curved, they have a feeling of movement and motion. Okay, so that's your curved stroke. And you can use any variation you want of it, and you can use any brush you want with it. But remember, if you're trying to get a curved stroke, it's good to start with a brush that's already rounded on top. Next, we have something called wet on wet blending. So usually when people are blending, they use larger brushes to start out with, but they end up with smaller details. And when they blend with those, they're smaller brushes. What we're talking about is wet on wet, where you take wet water, no other kind of water. There's always only wet water. And you go ahead and wet the canvas. Usually you want your water to be pretty clean if you're doing really light work. I'm not too worried about this because we're gonna have lots of different colors on here and it doesn't matter. So your canvas is wet, and what you're gonna do is you're going to go ahead and grab your color. I'm gonna plop a little bit of this yellow in the middle, like so, and I'm gonna go back and forth. Right now I'm using a flat brush. I'm gonna turn it sideways like this, using my pendulum stroke. And all it means is that the brush moves around and blends easily but quickly, and you have to be real precise with it because it's not very forgiving at first. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go ahead and add in some orange on the sides like this, back and forth, using my pendulum stroke. And you don't have to use your pendulum stroke. You can do something like this too, where you start over here on one side, then you start to grab more of a color like this. And you get lighter and lighter until you move over this way like that. Ooh, I grabbed way too much paint that time. This paint is very juicy. Looks like candy corn. And then what you can do is you can pull through it like that. You can start to blend one into the other, like so. You're getting little scoop lines right now because the brush itself is not a problem, but it's the colors and the paint itself which are being a little bit of a pain in the booty because they're so wet. And that's my fault for not checking to make sure that they hadn't thickened up a little bit, because we're using a low pigment and a soft body acrylic. So you can go back and forth, and you can blend any way you want, do whatever you want, but it's wet on wet by the time you're done. Now, wet on dry is you don't wet the surface anyway. You don't have paint down or you don't have water down first. Instead, you just have good old dry paint doing whatever it is that you're doing. And you can see here, if your canvas doesn't have wet paint on it, you're going to get pop through on your canvas. Okay, so wet on dry literally just means you're painting with wet paint on a dry surface. That's all. Okay, and then the last one here is dry brush. Now, dry brush is a favorite of mine for when you're finished and you want to lighten or darken an area. So what you do here is you get a little bit of a color. I'll start with, we'll just go ahead and paint this gently as a black here, like so. We'll add a little bit of some of this blue to make it kind of a brackish night, like so. Okay, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna fast forward in just a second, and instead of waiting for you to see this dry, I'll come back in a moment when it's been dry, and I'll show you how to use dry brush. So you're back here, and we're about to do some dry brushing. I'm gonna go ahead and do dry brush. Actually, I washed the other brush. I'm gonna use this fellow because, well, he's already dry, and that's perfect. I don't wanna wait anymore. Let's do some dry brushing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get just a little bit of white, a real tiny bit on this brush. I'm gonna rotate it through here. And some people don't like paint on them at all. I don't really mind. So I rotate on my hand or on a paper towel like that. And I'm gonna go up here. I'm gonna make a wobbly shape like this so that it peekaboos to some of the area below. A good way to do this is to scumble around in a circle like that, like so. And the reason this is nice is dry brushing lets you see below into the canvas, and then just the top parts of the canvas get paint on them when you dry brush. So dry brushing is a technique that's also used in other parts of art, things like sculpture when people are going ahead and painting, or when people are really into like board games and they paint miniatures, they use a lot of dry brushing. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to another brush now. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to, let's see, I'm gonna go back to a little filbert. Filbert is one of my favorite brushes because it's very versatile. I also really love big flat brushes. Those are some of my personal faves. So I'm gonna go ahead and stamp like so. And then I'm gonna start to make circles like this. Get the extra off, like so. Gentle, gentle. Put a little guy over here, like so. And you can add different layers onto it, or you can stipple on top of it. Dry brushing doesn't have to be in a circle. It just means that there's barely any paint on the surface of your brush, so that when you're using it, you're dusting it across, or you're kind of using a scumble, and it's about not necessarily the brush stroke that you're using, it's more about how much paint is on there. So for instance, you got a little night sky. Let's put a little moon peeking through, like so. Okay, so as you can see here, these different techniques are very helpful. they come into play in a lot of different things. So your angled strokes can come into play when you're doing something that's organic, but very rocky and sharp. It works really well for ground that's close to you and feels chunky. Curved strokes works really great for anything that shows motion. And if it's real gentle and it's curved brush strokes, you can make it look like wheat waving. You can make it look like grass from far away. You can also make it look like water. Your dry brushing can do lots of different things. It's more about what you see and what you don't see. You see the bottom of the canvas and you don't see the paint getting stuck in the whole canvas, so it's covering it. You see a little peek through. Wet on dry is real simple. It's exactly what it sounds like, and that works really well for really stark colors, just like this line work over here is real contrasty. And then you have blending, which is wet on wet, okay? And then you have scumbling, which is right down here, which is kind of scribbling. You have stippling right up here, which is a up and down motion where you change your brush in your hand. You have your pendulum stroke, one of my favorites, which is really good. Whichever brush you're using to go ahead and blend. And remember that from the side it looks like this, and this is the surface of your paper. Okay? And all these different strokes, even the fine line stroke, give you lots of different ways to paint. So some of these are the beginner ways. As you get further along, you'll learn to use brushes like the fan brush, which can do almost all of these different things. Any brush can do any of these things, but some brushes are better at these things. So this brush in particular is good for things like curved brush strokes for water, because when you press it down, it kind of naturally can follow you along curve, or it's got a curve to it already. So if you need splashes, you can tell that that would be a good brush for that. So remember, whichever type you're going to be using, think about one, the type of brush that you're going to use, just like we talked about prior to this. And then two, think about what you're trying to accomplish with that brush. What are you trying to get done? Remember that tools are just what they are. They're just tools, and you can use them any way you want, and that's all brushes are. So if you pick up a brush and you find a neat way to use a fan brush no one else has before, good for you. Don't worry, there's no art police. You can use it any way you want. One thing I will say though is, be gentle to your brushes, please. Be gentle to them. Don't beat them up. Take good care of them. Make sure you wash your brushes after every time. And make sure you keep an eyeball on the brushes down here, because that's where they gather paint. Thanks so much for watching. See you again soon.